Hi, and welcome back to Echoes from the Satellite. I'm your host, Karen. Today, we're going to be starting a new segment on the show. This will be something that'll be recurring, interspersed with other things, and we'll be focused on comics. We'll be focused on comics that have the element of science fiction. And so we're going to call it cosmic comics. I know, super original, right? But I wanted to do something dealing with comics because comics have been a big part of my life. Like a lot of you probably grew up reading comics. Comics was a way to get me into reading when I was really little. And they just kind of became a big part of, who I was and just enjoyed them a lot. I still enjoy them, but, I don't read new comics now. I still go back and read older comics. But yeah, they really made a mark on me. I actually did a comics blog with my good friend Doug. I cannot say enough good things about him. We did a blog called Bronze Age Babies for, gosh, I think about 8 or 9 years. So if uh, if you're interested in that, you can go out and just type in like Bronze Age Babies blog. And we had hundreds, maybe thousands of entries focusing on comic books in the 70s primarily, the Bronze Age, but we kind of drifted and looked at a lot of other comics and pop culture things. Um, but I've always been really fond of some science fiction mixed in with my comics. And so I wanted to do a little bit of that here on Echoes. And so I was thinking, well, what do I want to start with? And being kind of a Marvelite, my ideas went in that direction. I thought about Deathlock, who I really like a lot. I thought about Guardians of the Galaxy, the originals, but it kind of felt like the movie has maybe, I don't know, taken the sheen off that for me a little bit. Um, I really enjoy Warlock, but only the very early issues with Jim Starlin, who's my favorite artist. I even thought about Commandy, and that might still be, I know that's DC, but I thought about that. That might be a possibility down the road. And then I thought about something that really does tie in, has a very strong sci-fi connection because it picks up on a sci-fi novel, and that was Killraven or War of the Worlds from Amazing Adventures back in the 70s. And yes, I have an actual copy of the first issue here. I got this at a convention many, many years ago. I will say that my collection of early issues of Killraven is very spotty. You know, distribution of comics back in the day, kids, if you're on the younger side or don't know a lot about comics, back in the day, we didn't have dedicated comic book shops. We didn't have the distribution system through like Diamond. And so, yours truly and many other folks, uh, as kids, were heading out to, yes, bookstores, but also supermarkets, liquor stores, head shops, 7-Elevens, wherever you could find comics. And so a lot of times the distributors, weren't making sure that we had all the same books everywhere. And so following a series could become very difficult and your collection could be very spotty and you would have holes in the collection and you wouldn't get the same titles all the time. So early on, I didn't have a lot of issues of War of the Worlds with Killraven. And I think I only really started to pick up that book regularly once it got in the late 20s issues of that. However, not too long ago, I picked up this big honkin' beast of a book, this Marvel Epic collection, which is really nice because it has all the issues and has them all in color. So anyway, I'll be using that as my main reading material in this walkthrough of the series, and I'll probably break this up into. I'm thinking right now it's going to be either 3 or 4 segments. So we'll see how that goes. But if you don't know much about Killraven, Killraven is sort of it's the product of many creative hands, at least initially, and it traces back to originally to Roy Thomas. Now I will say that unfortunately in recent years, Mr. Thomas has been sort of caught up in sort of a what would you say? I don't want to say a scandal, but he has placed himself in the middle of making claims on a lot of different characters. That he has labeled himself as a co-creator of a lot of characters that previously had not claimed creator rights on, and this has created a lot of controversy in fandom, as far as I know. With characters like he's kind of claimed creator rights on Wolverine, and that's one of the big ones where essentially it sounds like what he did was he said, "Hey, let's have a character called Wolverine, and he should be Canadian." Does that make him as much a co-creator as somebody like Len Wein or John Romita, who designed the costume? You know, I have my opinions on this, and I'm sure many of you do as well. But I would say outside of that current controversy, Roy Thomas certainly did a lot to help Marvel grow and to develop writers and artists back in the 70s. And as far as Killraven goes, this book sprang out of kind of a list of ideas that he gave Stanley. Stanley requested a list of ideas, and there were a lot of different things on this list. He did have War of the Worlds. Let's have a War of the Worlds book, because it was in public domain at that time in the early 70s. Other things that were on this list were ideas like I, a Werewolf, which became, Werewolf by Night, and, a plethora of other things. And I will always salute Roy Thomas for being the one who said, let's get Conan. We can bring Conan to Marvel. And that he did that. He brought Star Wars. And, just as a writer overall, I have tremendous respect for him. So anyway, he had this list, and War of the Worlds was on it. And he had some general ideas for the book about the Martians returning to Earth, 100 years later. So the events in H.G. Wells' book, canonically in the Killraven universe, took place. And then about 100 years later, the Martians show up, and they've basically found a way to protect themselves from the bacteria and other microorganisms that impacted them in the original novel. And they've, prepared themselves to come back and take over our planet. And so that was the core concepts that he had for it. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to essentially pit Earthmen into as he said, a guerrilla warfare against Martians. So he talked about this with his frequent collaborator, Neil Adams, artist Neil Adams, and he talked with Neil Adams over the phone and kind of told him this idea he had. And the next day, Neil Adams comes over, and he's got this, plot and a lead character designed and all this other stuff. And so Thomas is like, well, okay, let's roll with this, right? The only thing was, though, that Adams was already overbooked. So he'd started drawing the book, but he couldn't finish it. So then they had to bring in Howard Chaykin to finish the rest of what became issue 18 of Amazing Adventures. And Thomas was also too busy to write the whole thing, because he was editor-in-chief at that time, so he had a lot of other stuff. So he brings in Jerry Conway. It seems like Jerry Conway was everywhere at Marvel at that time. So he brings in Jerry Conway to script the first issue. And so, he's essentially, we have Jerry Conway as the writer on Amazing Adventures 18, Neil Adams and Howard Chaykin as the artists, with Frank Chiaramonte inking, and some obvious Romita touch-ups, which I'll put on screen here as we talk about the story. So many folks involved, and of course Roy with the initial idea. But that's how we get this strange amalgam of folks putting together Killraven, and that becomes our first issue, Amazing Adventures 18, in May, cover dated May 1973. So let's take a look at what happens in that issue. All right, let's take a look at this first issue of War of the Worlds featuring Killraven. The cover very clearly looks to be John Romita senior art. I will look that up and make sure, but I'm pretty positive about that. And you know, that costume, uh, honestly, the costume in this issue looks pretty silly or nowadays. You know, with it's almost like Zardoz, to be honest. Um, I also realized that Neil Adams, this kind of design with almost a bikini with, I don't know, maybe sort of a harness and the thigh high boots. I mean, I don't know. I want to get into a lot here, but it reminds me a lot of sort of uh, kind of bondage sex stuff going on. Not that I know anything about that, but it has that overtones, or also sort of a male stripper kind of thing going on. Thankfully the costume will change in a few issues, and we'll get that more familiar kind of unitard blue with the yellow stars. But anyway, this first issue and a few more issues, we're going to have to get through this costume. But we can see first page here, set in 2018, the far-flung realms of 2018 AD. And Killraven is fighting his way through a bunch of um, rather aggressive and unseemly looking fellows. And you know, it could almost be a Conan magazine, except for like the Kodak bulletin board up here. And then, you know, Killraven is very determined to get to the keeper, whoever the keeper is. And so he's fighting his way um, through, you know, this, uh, what used to be Grand Central Station. So, you know, it's post-apocalyptic. And then all these mutants come out, and he's dealing with them just as physically as he dealt with his human adversaries. You know, and he's telling the keeper he's going to settle a score, and says some pretty negative things about scientists. And then this elderly gentleman comes out and says, "Oh, once scientists were respected." And he says, "Well, that was a long time ago." And throws this piece of machinery at him and seems to hit him dead on in the chest, but perhaps has a little regret here. And we're still in the Neil Adams art. You can tell the way things are composed here, the artwork. You can tell this is Neil Adams, but I think we're going to jump into Chaykin for a page, and then some more Neil Adams, and then the rest will be Howard Chaykin. So, um, you know, the keeper is still hanging in there, so he can give some exposition. And you know, he starts telling him like, well, you know, here's what happened to the world. And so for us readers, we get filled in about, you know, what happened, the original invasion of War of the Worlds back in the day from the H.G. Wells novel, and we get a pretty cool looking tripod there, destroying, you know, some British dwellings. And you know, we learn all about that and how they were originally defeated because you know, bacteria, they couldn't resist our germs. And but then the keeper says, well, you know, but then they figured out what to do. And then, you know, they came back 100 years later, and they knew how they they could win. They knew about our H bombs, and they knew how to defeat them. They overloaded our nuclear weapons and blew them all up. And then they released a biological weapon on us. And so, all these things happened, and mankind was essentially um, taken, taken prisoner because they couldn't compete with the Martians. And now here's the point where we go into the Howard Chaykin art. I think you can tell the difference here. Although I don't know if it really looks, and I'm not a big Howard Chaykin reader, but I don't know that this is his definitive look. I think he was still developing. And they start telling about how what happened to Killraven, his mother. Now this looks a lot like Harry Mudd from Star Trek to me, but maybe that's just me. I see it going a little bit out of focus here, but I'll try to get that in focus. So there's, Killraven and his mom, and they thought they were safe, but they had to go down into this subterranean place where they met this woman fighting out, and then they thought they were being rescued, but as it turned out, the scientists just wanted to get the children. And so, you know, they stole the children to train to become gladiators, apparently to amuse them. And so this is, as he's got this enormous piece of metal stuck in his chest, the keeper is telling Killraven about all these things that happened, and then how they brought him in front of a Martian master who apparently is in this sort of receptacle here, to sustain him, and how you're going to be turned into gladiators to amuse their master, and then he was trained to be a fighting machine using all sorts of weaponry. But Killraven was rebellious, and he managed to escape. And then he spent time, foraging and learning the land, the lay of the land. And, he started collecting people. And then he learned about these sirens, these women that the Martians had created who could, um, weave a spell over men. And, kind of telling of Killraven's adventures as he tried to come back to the keeper. We can see that he availed himself of some luxuries along the way. And this outfit, it's killing me. I don't know. Maybe in the 70s it wouldn't have bothered me as much. I don't really remember. I think when I really came to the book, he was already in the other outfit. And then the keeper kind of tells Killraven that he's special, that he has some sort of special power that he can use against the Martians. But then he dies, so we can't really tell him anymore. And Killraven's like, "What? What? I'm just a man. What are you talking about?" And Killraven has to fight off one last mutant before he can leave. But then the sirens of Seventh Avenue show up, and so we have to wait. And I think this was being published, if I'm not incorrect. Oh, and I think, is that maybe a Romita correction? I know I talked about some Romita corrections. I felt like there might have been a few here. I think we had to wait 2 months to get to the next one. I think they were on a bi-monthly schedule. And then we have this nice little in-between page for us. And you see an older outfit, a later outfit. So we don't have kind of the skimpy bikini look. And I think that's P. Craig Russell, who will do a lot of the later looks, the later illustrations on the book. Hi, everybody. We're back. You might have noticed I things have changed a little bit. I have to admit that I'm recording this at a different time than I recorded the first part of this video. Had a lot of things going on, and so I wasn't able to finish that video at the same time. And in fact, I'm going to be heading out tomorrow to a conference for work, but I didn't want to leave you guys without something this week. And it's been really hard for me to get videos out, but I decided, what the heck, I'm going to go ahead and get this video out. So I know I said I was going to do multiple issues. This time around, we're just going to look at the first issue of Killraven. Hopefully there's enough there for you to enjoy. And then when I get back, besides some other things I've got planned, we'll follow up with some more issues of Killraven. Hopefully I can find a better stand for my camera. I feel like that was a little bit wonky, but we'll look around and see what we can find to get maybe a little more stable camera setup. But I hope you enjoyed that. I mean, for me going through it now, it's such a product of the 70s. And I love the 70s. I love comics and movies and shows from the 70s. But those early issues, and I've read through a few more issues. Those early issues are pretty. Let's just say they're an acquired taste. So we'll go back soon and we'll look at the rest of those Killraven issues. But I hope you enjoyed this taste, especially if you weren't familiar with Killraven. I hope that this maybe encourages you to seek out some Killraven, especially the later issues, which I have to say, the story really gets good later on. So once we get past a little shakiness early on, it turns into a pretty darn good story. So anyway, that's it for now. I hope everybody's doing great, staying well, staying safe. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you back again real soon.